January 1945. A wet wind drifts across barbed wire and Nissen huts on the edge of a Lincolnshire field. The ground pitted with thawing frost and tire marks from lorries that did not stop long enough to steam in the cold. The gates swing back. A column of German prisoners, hollow-eyed from the Atlantic crossing and the long trains north, steps down in stiff silence, boots slapping mud, faces turned by instinct towards the guard towers and then, unexpectedly, towards the smell of soup. In a tin-roofed cookhouse, RAF enamel mugs clatter. Ladles dip, stew thick with barley, carrots, and what looks like beef. Ladled without ceremony but with measure, as per the board on the wall. Rations recorded to the ounce. The Geneva Convention pinned beside the day's work detail. One prisoner takes the bowl with both hands as if it might be taken back. Another, younger than the uniform suggests, tries to speak, then stares at the steam and lowers his head. The British sergeant nods him on. No speeches, no display, just food warmth and the sharp relief of not being harmed. In a corner, the chaplain watches in quiet, while a Red Cross inspector notes the calorific intake and the state of bedding for his next report. For men taught to expect brutality, the first mouthful breaks something inside, and the tears come unbidden into a country still on rations, still under strain, but determined to keep its honor intact. This is where the story begins, with rules, restraint, and a hot meal offered to the enemy. Britain entered 1945 with a conflicted burden: victory in sight, rationing at home, and a growing responsibility for tens of thousands of enemy prisoners brought to these shores under the rules of war and the pressure of Allied logistics. The policy was not sentimental. It was administrative, legal, and strategic, drawing on the Hague and Geneva frameworks and War Office files that measured food, fuel, labor, and inspection regimes to the ounce and the hour. When the Western Front ruptured after Normandy, the flow of captives outpaced continental capacity, prompting the War Cabinet to authorize large-scale transfer of German POWs to the UK, to stabilize camps, secure labor, and uphold a standard of treatment consistent with Britain's own sense of conduct. By early 1945, camp numbers surged from holding depots to a lattice of base camps, satellite hostels and farm billets across England, Scotland, and Wales, many adapted from training grounds, airfields, and purpose-built compounds of wire, watchtowers, and Nissen hut barracks. On paper, treatment was governed by files and forms. In practice, it was enforced by inspections, parliamentary scrutiny, and the culture of a professional army under civilian oversight. The Foreign Office maintained dossiers of Red Cross and protecting power visits, while specific camp files tracked sanitation, medical provision, work details, and the conduct of guards and prisoners alike. At Q, researchers still follow the trail through FO 916's FO 939 and WO2 22 for snapshots of daily reality. Food policy sat at the heart of the British approach, calibrated against scarce national supplies and the obligation to keep working prisoners fit. In the Commons, War Secretary Sir James Grigg spelled out that non-working POWs received rations closely aligned to civilians, while work detachments drew scales equivalent to troops in mess, an unpopular but deliberate balance of fairness and utility. The debate captured the mood of a rationed nation. No one wanted indulgence, but nor would Britain starve captives while demanding their labor in fields and timber camps. Numbers tell the magnitude of the challenge, and the sense of order Britain imposed upon it. In May 1945, with surrender signed, German POWs in Britain already ran into the hundreds of thousands, rising still as men shipped from the United States, Canada, and liberated European depots disembarked at British ports instead of returning home. The total peaked at roughly 402,000 in September 1946, even as repatriation began, a paradox of post-war Europe: war over, obligations not yet done. Administrative records show the system's breadth: camp location lists, employment directives, hospital war diaries, and intelligence liaison on policy with Allied partners, all designed to keep order, prevent abuse, and extract necessary work within the law. That structure underwrote the moments of quiet humanity witnessed at the wire: the hot stew, the clean bunk, which did not happen by chance but because a rule-bound state made them possible. The landscape of camps was as British as hedgerows and railway sidings, visible and ordinary, yet carrying the residue of battle in every face behind the wire. Historic England survey reveals a web of sites from Suffolk to Shropshire, from Scottish depots to Welsh hostels, many near farms needing hands, many close to transport spines. A wartime geography repurposed for custody and labor. Semi-autonomous hostels grew around the base camps, allowing working parties to live closer to fields and woods while guards, medics, and administrators cycled through with military regularity and an eye on discipline without cruelty. For local communities, the camps were both strange and familiar. Foreign uniforms at the bus stop, German accents in the hedgerows, and the knowledge that the men had been shooting back only months before. Medical provision, though strained, was integrated into the regime. Visiting British doctors and dentists supplemented by qualified German medical personnel maintained camp health, with War Office hospital files and Red Cross reports documenting outbreaks, dental drills, and the slow business of keeping underfed men stable on rationed diets. Inspection regimes recorded bedding, latrines, water supply, and kitchen, the unglamorous backbone of humane custody, and their language is cool, tabulated and precise, the necessary prose of a state managing former enemies within the law, against the memory of camps elsewhere in Europe where men starved on black bread and thin soup. The British system's insistence on measured calorific scales and proper cooking facilities formed a moral line as much as a logistical one. Work transformed the camps into engines of national recovery without losing sight of legality. Farm labor was formalized under War Office and Ministry of Agriculture coordination, with German POWs harvesting, ditching, sawing timber, and repairing hedges, their output essential to food production at a time when imports were tight and manpower scarce. Policy explicitly tied higher rations to heavier work, not indulgence but the fuel required for field labor, and contemporaries, including MPs, wrestled in public with the optics and the ethics. In this setting, the act of serving a hot meal to new arrivals, men who had eaten irregularly and traveled hard, was not an extravagance but an assertion of Britain's rules, a signal to prisoners and to the nation that standards would hold even under strain. Behind the wire, daily life ran on rosters, inspections, and an ethic that treatment must be lawful, measurable, and seen to be so, not least because Parliament and the press asked exacting questions about rations, labor, and fairness under rationing at home. In the Commons in March 1945, Sir James Grigg set out the scales with unusual clarity. Non-working prisoners were held close to civilian ration standards, while those on work details drew the heavier troops in mess scale, a calculation rooted in calories, not kindness, and defended with reference to international convention. The exchange captured the British dilemma: to demand work to bolster food production and forestry while ensuring that those same men were fit to do it, and to do so in a way that would stand up to neutral scrutiny and future archival review. The camp network itself reflected purpose more than spectacle. Base compounds with medical huts and guard rooms, surrounded by smaller hostels that pushed men closer to farms and timber stands where they were needed most. Historic England's survey of sites reveals a practical geography of custody, wire and watchtowers sited near railheads, workshops, and fields that turned former training grounds and requisitioned estates into orderly systems of accommodation and work allocation. War Office coordination with the Ministry of Agriculture channeled thousands of pairs of hands into harvests, hedging, and drainage, the unglamorous work that kept shelves stocked and fields viable as shipping lanes remained vulnerable, and British manpower was still tied to demobilization schedules. Oversight remained the keystone of legitimacy. Files at Q-track visits, medical notes, and the tidy prose of inspectors who checked latrines, bedding, kitchens, and infirmaries with the same cool attention they brought to musters and work lists. Where problems arose, diet complaints, medical shortages, or discipline issues, the remedy was procedural: adjust rations for heavy work, assign doctors or qualified German medics, and escalate repeated concerns through the War Office chain, leaving paper trails that still map the rhythm of camp life today. Even the most human moments, a chaplain's service, a guard's quiet word, a steaming bowl for new arrivals, sat within a framework of rules that was intended to be consistent and reviewable. Food remained the sharpest point of comparison between Britain's camps and the hunger that haunted much of wartime Europe. While British civilians juggled points and coupons, official answers affirmed that working prisoners would receive more than the civilian ration, not as a moral reward, but as a contractual fuel for labor. posted in the official report to forestall rumors of indulgence. Knowledge of Red Cross parcel systems, so central to Allied prisoners in German hands, informed British thinking about calorific sufficiency and kitchen practice, even though the parcel economy was a different mechanism from the United Kingdom's state-issued scales. The principle was constant. Meals should be hot, regular, and adequate to the task. Newly arrived men, often underweight after transit, were to be stabilized sensibly, with kitchens taught to stretch meat with barley, potatoes, and vegetables, avoiding rich shocks to fragile digestion. Numbers tell a quieter story of magnitude. By late 1945 and into 1946, Britain held hundreds of thousands of Germans, the peak often cited at around 400 to 1 in September 1946 as repatriation. Timetables collided with European disarray and Allied labor needs. Camps diversified their functions. Some became medical hubs with dental chairs and infirmaries. Others specialized in forestry or agriculture. Many spun off hostels so work parties could bed down near fields and sawmills, returning to base only for pay parades, medical boards, or disciplinary hearings. Through it all, paper moved. Returns of work done, calories issued, boots repaired, and sermons delivered, creating a record that anchors memory to verifiable practice. These structures, debates, and ledgers explain the shock of that first British meal for men conditioned to expect the worst. A hot stew served under a posted regulation was not just food. It was proof of a system that chose order over vengeance, even as the war's toll bore down on every household and shop. Britain's insistence on humane custody, audited and argued in public, set the stage for the intimate, human scenes within the wire, the tears, the relief, the first night without fear, moments that mattered precisely because they were backed by rules strong enough to hold. Human shock and gratitude, the array. First British meal met men whose bodies were light with hunger and minds braced for reprisal, and it arrived with a precision that felt unreal. A posted ration scale, a measured ladle, bread issued by count, tea poured without a word. In the British frame, the point was compliance with law and labor needs. In the German frame, it was dissonance, an enemy who fed you well enough to work and recorded it in ledgers that would survive inspection. The relief could be overwhelming. Warmth in the hands, steam in the lungs, the taste of fat after months of thin fare, and the quiet realization that survival here would depend on rules, not whim. Tears were not simply sentiment. They were release from anticipation of violence replaced by routine. Muster, meal, billet, the ordinary mercies of a system designed and defended in Parliament to be adequate and observable. British decency under rationing. The decision to feed and house prisoners to lawful standards was made in a nation counting ounces at home, which made the choice more striking and more heavily scrutinized. When MPs demanded to know why a working German might receive more than a British civilian, the answer was blunt. If Britain required labor in farm and forest, Britain must provide the calories to power it, because that was both useful and within the Hague and Geneva obligations that anchored national honor. That stance was reinforced by a paper architecture, inspection visits, medical notes, and returns of work and rations that allowed officials to show not only that standards existed, but that they were enforced with the same cool tone found in War Office guides and research files today. Humane treatment was not a flourish. It was a policy that could be enumerated and defended, and it shaped countless small encounters at the wire and in the cookhouse where restraint became habit. Intelligence and influenced by fairness, fair treatment had tactical value beyond labor. Disciplined custody created conditions in which information flowed more readily, and ideological certainties loosened, particularly when the daily experience contradicted the propaganda carried from the front. The British state understood that a lawful, orderly regime, and with posted rations, medical care, and predictable work, could be more persuasive than lectures, and it built oversight to sustain credibility when challenged by protecting powers or neutral observers. Parliamentary candor about rations for working parties did its own quiet work, signaling to prisoners, through rumor networks and notices, that scales were set, not arbitrary, and that complaints would be handled procedurally rather than punitively. In this way, the kitchen and the ledger became instruments not just of sustenance, but of confidence building, a slow erosion of fear that made cooperation thinkable. Medical caution and the lesson of refeeding, Feeding hungry men is not simply a question of kindness. It is physiology, and 1945 Britain had learned, at terrible cost elsewhere, that rich food given too quickly can kill. At Bergen-Belsen, British officers and medics discovered that standard rations overwhelmed starved bodies, and improvised thin stews and controlled diets until medical guidance caught up with need. The principle traveled into doctrine: start light, stabilize, and build up carefully. Though German POWs arriving in Britain were not concentration camp survivors, many were underweight and exhausted, and British medical oversight within the camp system, with inspections, infirmaries, and qualified personnel, treated diet as treatment, not indulgence. The first hot bowl mattered emotionally. The measured progression that followed mattered medically, and both were sustained by rules designed to keep men fit for work without courting avoidable harm. Work, routine, and the dignity of order camp life settled into a cadence that restored predictability. Reveille, roll call breakfast by ration scale, work parties formed at the gate, return to barracks, and inspection of billets and kit, all under a regime meant to be lawful and regular. Archaeological and photographic records of British camps show workshops, sports pitches, classrooms, and Nissen hut cobbleries. The ordinary infrastructure of routine that turned idle hours into useful labor and skill, and idleness into structure. This order mattered because it affirmed a promise implicit in the first meal, that days would be measured by rules, not reprisals, and that men would be judged by their conduct, not their ideology, so long as they obeyed the regulations posted on the notice board. Within that framework, the cookhouse remained central. Calories equated to capacity, and capacity to trusted work details. A virtuous circle sustained by ledgers, inspections, and the quiet professionalism of British staff. Civilians and the porous edge of the wire Britain's approach brought prisoners into the rural economy, and with that came encounters beyond the perimeter. Fields shared with British farmhands, tools passed hand to hand, and occasional exchanges of bread, apples, or tobacco that softened the outline of enmity without erasing it. Public initiatives and local experiments, lectures, visits to civic institutions, chaplaincies, and concerts framed these contacts as education in British civics rather than fraternization, an exercise in demonstrating the habits of a constitutional society to men raised in a dictatorship. The tone remained deliberately modest. A cup of tea at a village hall, a talk by a magistrate, a union representative explaining a wage slip. Small, observable acts intended to anchor re-education in lived experience rather than slogans. For many prisoners, the memory of that first meal became the emotional shorthand for everything that followed beyond the wire. Restraint, fairness, and a Britain that insisted on rules even when no one was watching. Leadership, discipline, and moral economy. Commandants, adjutants, medical officers, and chaplains carried the culture of the British Army into the camps, translating doctrine into daily practice, posted orders, charge sheets when needed, medical boards for the unfit, and steady enforcement without spectacle. Their authority drew legitimacy from visibility. Inspections logged, rations explained, complaints docketed, and from the willingness to tie decisions to written scales known in Parliament and available to scrutiny. This was a moral economy as much as an administrative one. The state would keep its word, feed to scale, and expect labor and discipline in return, with sanctions recorded and appeal routes defined. In that context, the generosity perceived by prisoners in a hot first meal was not indulgence but policy, a deliberate assertion that Britain's strength lay in law, not loudness, and that conduct once set would not waver with mood. Technology, kitchens, and the craft of feeding behind the ladle stood logistics, coal allocations for field kitchens, enamelware stamped for service, and menus adapted to ration realities, stews thickened with barley and root vegetables, tea brewed to scale, bread counted by loaf and slice. British records linked cooking practice to nutrition. Working parties required higher calorific intake, and kitchens were instructed to deliver heat and digestibility, not luxury, adjusting fat and protein within the posted scales to keep men fit without waste. Photographs and ground evidence point to wired compounds where kitchens were hubs, hot plates, water points, ladles clattering, and to workshops where prisoners repaired boots, planned timber, or learned trades that filled hours and supported the wider economy. The first meal's meaning endured because the system behind it held, measured, inspectable and sufficiently humane to turn former enemies into reliable hands. Day after day, under the same gray British sky, June 1945. Dusk settles late over a Shropshire base camp, the sky a cold wash of blue-gray, the fields clipped to stubble beyond the wire. A convoy has come in from the docks. Men step down slowly, hands to the tailboards, boots skating on caked mud. They carry the look of a long passage, salt in their uniforms, a dullness in the eyes that only steady food and sleep can lift. The gate sergeant takes the count against a typed nominal roll. A medical officer scans faces for fever and shock. Behind them, the cookhouse fires have already been banked high. There is a menu pinned up, not a promise of plenty, but a declaration of scale, bread by portion, tea by mug, stew ladled to working or non-working measure. The calculus of a rationed nation stated plainly on a board that mirrors a debate already printed in the official report in London. The first men through scarcely look at the wire. They look at the steam that beads on the windows and at the enamel that waits in stacks by the hatch. Each cup a small reassurance that someone has thought of numbers, of heat, of order. It is the same logic that threads through files in Whitehall and Kew. Inspections, medical notes, visit reports. The prosaic machinery that keeps law alive in a country still counting losses. At the hatch, the ladle moves in a steady arc. Barley swells the stew. Root vegetables sweeten what small fat there is. The sergeant calls the measure. One man's hands shake so badly that the cup must be set down for him. Another takes his bread and tears it in half before he tastes it. An instinct born of thin days and shared hunger. The chaplain stands aside, not intruding, ready with spare cutlery and a word if asked. His presence a quiet statement that faith has a place here, but not as a condition for food. The noise is domestic. Spoons against enamel, boots on boards, the clink of mugs, and then it is broken by a sharp intake of breath that catches in the chest and will not be smoothed. A corporal looks up. The man in front of him is crying, not loudly, but with the suddenness of safety arriving sooner than pride can manage. No one remarks upon it. The guard nods him to a bench. The medical officer watches the pace of eating, while not too fast, and the cooks, briefed by their officers and by the cautionary lessons of spring, keep the stew plain and the portions even, avoiding shocks to bodies that need a week to remember how to be strong. What matters in this moment is not just the warmth of the bowl. It is the posted certainty, the notice that says how much and when, the knowledge that tomorrow there will be more, measured and recorded because a state has decided that feeding an enemy according to scale is both obligation and policy. It is an argument made in Parliament that working parties must be fed to work, and non-workers held close to the civilian ration, and defended on the grounds that law, once chosen, must be kept even when it is unpopular. It is an argument supported by the ledger, the inspector's signature, the medical tally, the return of rations issued, lodged in the repositories that give administrative choices their afterlife in paper and ink. And it is felt in small ways at every table. The first sip of hot tea, the loosening of shoulders that have been held tight for months, the unlooked-for dignity of eating under a roof in a country still governed by rules that apply at the wire as surely as they do in the house. By week's end, the convoy's men are spread between base barracks and work hostels. The same measured food, the same notices. Now frame the next phase. Work parties formed at dawn, fields and timber yards in need of hands, calories aligned to the task as stated in the very answers put on the record to quell rumor and justify policy. The camp's routines and roll call, sick parade, inspection show their deeper purpose to assure prisoners, guards and civilians that order is not a mood, but a system designed to withstand strain, defendable in file and in person. The first meal has done more than fill stomachs. It has laid down a line that will hold as numbers rise into the hundreds of thousands, and as Britain, exhausted and precise, keeps to a standard that can be checked and, if needed, challenged. That is the turn, fear into routine, hostility into rules, hunger into a schedule that points, quietly, towards work, recovery, and a different understanding of the people on the other side of the ladle. What changed in that week was not spectacle but trust, a fragile contract written in steam and routine, strengthened by the certainty that the scales on the notice board would be the same tomorrow and next week, because the policy behind them had already been set and defended in London. The argument was stark and public. If Britain asked for labor, it must feed to labor standards, and if prisoners were not working, their ration must still align with what civilians endured, so that justice could be explained as well as done. That clarity filtered down the chain of command. Commandants briefed cooks, medics briefed guards on slow and steady feeding for men thinned by travel, and every change in scale or duty left a trail of initials in a ledger that inspectors could read line by line. The first tiers at the hatch were not a singular event. They were the visible crest of a policy designed to replace fear with predictability, one portion at a time. By midsummer, the compound's rhythm became the prisoner's own. Dawn roll call, a hot drink, working parties formed by name, rations adjusted to task and returns logged in a neat hand at the orderly room. The effect was cumulative. Men who had braced for humiliation saw instead a system that linked their stomachs, their strength, and their dignity to written scales and publicly stated principles. In the evenings, hostels near fields and timber stands served the same stews. The same counted bread, and men compared notes, not about cruelty or caprice, but about ounces, work hours, and the small satisfactions of a day governed by rules rather than grudges. The wire still stood, the sentries still watched, but the moral weather had shifted. The enemy had become a workforce under law, not a captive under threat. Elsewhere in Europe, chaos had taught a harder lesson, that starved bodies cannot bear sudden richness. The spring's medical cautions, born of tragedy and improvisation, rippled into British practice, reinforcing what the camp MOs already knew. Start gently, feed evenly, and build strength by design, not by enthusiasm. In the cookhouse, this looked like restraint. Barley for body, vegetables for sweetness, fat meted out to scale. And the medical officer's quiet circuit among tables as men ate, a human audit as essential as any signature in an inspection book. It explained why relief arrived as steadiness, not as feast, why gratitude could be quiet and tears brief, and why the next morning's mug mattered as much as the first night's bowl. The turning point reached beyond the gate. In villages, farmhands watched German parties work, and saw that they returned fed, orderly, and punctual. Suspicion softened into the practical language of tools, weather, and output. The state's public candor about rations and work, those debated figures that could be pointed to in print, gave civilians an answer when asked why an enemy might seem to eat better than a neighbor. Because the task required it, because the law required it, and because Britain had chosen to be the sort of country that could explain itself. By autumn, that explanation had sunk in. The first meal's shock had become a memory that prisoners could test against each day and find intact, and guards could point to with quiet pride as proof that discipline included decency. The first winter after victory pressed hard on the country and on the camps. Shortages, cold, and the slow unwinding of a war economy into something that could feed and employ millions without the habits of emergency. Within the wire, routine became recovery by design. Rations held to scale. Work parties stabilized. Medical oversight vigilant. The same choices that framed the first meal now carrying men toward strength rather than mere survival. The argument that had been made in Parliament held its shape across the seasons. Calories for labor, civilian-level scales for the rest, and every adjustment justified on paper, so that the policy could be shown to the nation as much as to the prisoners themselves. Agriculture was the hinge on which much of this turned. Hostels near fields took men out before dawn, boots damp with dew, shovels and billhooks in hand, the day's work dictating the day's ration, heavier for timber gangs and ditching crews, steady for hedging and harvest carting, all of it entered in the tidy hand of an orderly clerk. Historic surveys of campsites show the practical Britain that emerged. Compounds by railheads, cookhouses near water points, saw pits at the edge of coppice, a geography of necessity that made it possible to eat, to work, and to send the completed tallies back through channels that demanded accuracy as a point of honor. Feeding remained both symbol and system. Kitchens continued to cook to scale, stews thickened with barley, vegetables in season, fat apportioned with care, tea strong enough to carry men across damp afternoons. The point was not indulgence, but endurance, a message posted as much as served. Medical officers kept the lesson of careful feeding close. Begin modestly with the underweight, increase steadily, monitor digestion and weight, turning the cookhouse into part of the infirmary's quiet work of rebuilding bodies without shock or waste. It was the same moral economy made visible. The state would keep its word at the stove as surely as at the gate, and the result would be strength measured in tons of timber felled and acres turned rather than in speeches. Outside the wire, civilian contact gathered pace under supervision that was brisk rather than theatrical. Public initiatives framed talks, concerts, and lectures as civics rather than sentiment. Magistrates explaining law, chaplains speaking to conscience, union men describing wages and timekeeping, practical lessons delivered with the same restraint that governed the ladle. Workside habits did the rest, a shared spade, a shouted warning when a cart rolled, a nod at the end of a long day. The memories men carried back to barracks were of order, not exception, and of a Britain that could explain why it fed as it did. The ledger kept its quiet rhythm. Inspections logged kitchens and barracks. Medical notes tracked weight and convalescence. Returns listed rations issued, work hours and stoppages for rain or repair. Building an archive of ordinary decency that still underpins what can be said with confidence about those years. When questions rose, rumors about generosity, disputes about scales, officials could point to the same printed answers that had framed the policy from the start. Working men fed to work. Non-workers kept close to civilians, all of it lawful, all of it checkable. In that steadiness, the emotion of the first meal found its meaning, a promise held. Repatriation came slowly, not as a parade, but as a timetable of sailings, railheads, and dossiers, each embarkation the end of a routine that had become oddly protective for men who had learned to trust the posted scales in a foreign land. Britain held large numbers into 1946 and beyond. The peak commonly cited at around 402,000 the previous autumn. As labor needs, European dislocation and Allied coordination stretched the schedule for return. Paperwork bore the weight. Medical boards to certify fitness to travel, disciplinary records summarized, and personal effects listed with the neat precision that had governed rations and work, a final administrative kindness that matched the first night's bowl in principle if not in emotion. Not all went home at once, and not all chose to go. Some men, having labored in British fields and timber, had formed ties that felt sturdier than the uncertain prospects of a Germany under occupation and division. Marriages, job offers, and the quiet pull of predictability turned prisoners into residents with permission and purpose. The state, still cautious and methodical, managed these transitions within law, permits, employment placements, and English lessons folded into the same camp spaces that had once measured bread and stew, a repurposing that made continuity visible in huts and hearths. For those who left, the journey reversed the sequence they knew by heart. Roll call, issue of rations for travel, the last inspection of kit, then lorries to the station and trains to the port, a calendar of movement that promised no surprises because the surprises of war had already been spent. On the quays, the same restraint held, handshakes from guards, a nod from the medical officer, and the steady shuffle onto gangways where ships waited to cross short seas and long distances back into a country which many had not seen since they were very young. The ledger recorded departures as it had recorded meals, closing files with the same tidy completeness that had made the kitchens honest and the work parties punctual. What remained in Britain were traces, field boundaries repaired by careful hands, planked fences, coppices thinned to schedule, and the memory in villages of foreign labor that arrived on time, worked hard and left quietly. Campsites found second lives, some as temporary housing in a nation short of roofs, some as resettlement spaces for Polish allies who would not or could not return east. The Nissen huts and cookhouses bending again to the needs of peace. In archives and surveys, the map of custody became a map of continuity, the wire removed, the posts left to lean in hedgerows as reminders that rules had stood here and held under strain. The moral accounting did not ask for applause. In Parliament, the justification had been made simply and in the open. If Britain demanded labor, it must feed for labor. If not, it must feed at least to civilian standards because law and national character required nothing less. That clarity had weathered the anger of war and the fatigue of peace. And it traveled home with the men who returned. A story told in kitchens and in letters about an enemy who served hot stew and kept to its word. In that sense, the first meal's quiet shock was more than a scene. It was a standard. It shaped the months that followed, the work done, the files closed, the friendships that endured, and the choices some men made to stay in the country whose rules had fed them when they were weakest. And when the last huts were cleared and the last notices taken down, what lingered was not the sound of boots on boards, but the knowledge that a ration scale posted on a wall can be an instrument of mercy when it is backed by a nation determined to keep its measure. In the end, it was a simple thing that carried the greatest weight: a hot meal, measured and posted, served without indignity to men who had been enemies only days before. The act sat within a lattice of law and logistics. Rations scaled to labor or to civilian equivalents, inspections recorded, medical officers cautious about how strength returns, but its meaning was felt at the table, where restraint became mercy and rules became trust. Britain, still on rations, chose to make decency verifiable. The notice board matched the ladle, the ledger matched the promise, and the policy was explained in public so that fairness would not depend on mood. This was not sentimental. It was constitutional, the habits of a country that prefers order to theater and accountability to noise. The wire did not vanish, the sentries did not stand down, and the work demanded from prisoners was real. Yet the standard held that if labor was required, fuel must be provided, and if captivity was imposed, it must be kept within law even when law was unpopular. That steadiness turned a first shock, tears over stew and bread, into a lasting measure of character, something that prisoners carried home in letters and memory, and guards recognized as the best of their profession. In a war that brutalized, this choice mattered because it resisted the gravity of vengeance. It bound Britain to a future in which records could be read and conduct defended, and it taught quietly that strength can look like a scale pinned to a wall and a ladle wielded without favor. The fields, the forests, and the tidy files bear witness to a principle as plain as the enamel on a camp mug. Keep your measure, even when no one is watching. Hold to the rules when it would be easier not to. Let mercy be a function of discipline, so that men who arrive hollow-eyed can learn, one steady meal at a time, what it means to live under law.